The wind had barely settled on my porch when I saw 3 small figures standing there, their clothes wrinkled, their faces pale, and their eyes holding the kind of silence children should never know. I was still gripping my walker, pain radiating through my hip, when the realization hit me like a cold blade to the chest. Something was terribly wrong, and whatever had brought them here was far darker than simple inconvenience. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes the quietest moments reveal the loudest truths. As I reached for the door frame to steady myself, I felt the shift in my life begin. Let me show you how it all began. I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the car door slam outside my house. I was barely 2 weeks out of hip surgery, still unsteady on my walker, moving through my small place in Fort Collins like someone learning to balance all over again. My body felt fragile, pulled tight with pain and medication haze, and I was doing everything I could to protect the little energy I had. But that afternoon, all of that was shattered in an instant. I opened the door and saw my 3 grandchildren standing on the porch. No warning, no explanation. Just 3 small faces carrying more weariness than any child should ever carry. I remember the way the wind lifted their hair, revealing shadows beneath their eyes, the way their clothes looked slept in, the way none of them stepped forward until I moved first. It hit me all at once, that uneasy heaviness in my chest, the kind that grows from instinct rather than reason. I felt the betrayal before I even understood it. Their mother had simply disappeared, leaving them there as if I were a drop box instead of a recovering grandmother who could barely walk from one room to the next. And yet, beneath the shock, something else rose in me, something I had not expected to feel so soon after surgery. A quiet, fierce protectiveness that pushed past the pain. I welcomed them inside, already sensing that this moment was only the beginning, and that the truth about their lives would reveal itself soon enough. I noticed the first signs only an hour after the children stepped into my house. It was in the way they moved, almost silently, as if sound itself might trigger something unwelcome. I watched them hover near the kitchen doorway, waiting for permission they were too afraid to ask for. Their clothes, now that I could really see them, were rumpled and stained, carrying that tired look fabric gets when it has gone too many days without a proper wash. It struck me harder than I expected, that small detail speaking louder than anything they could have said. When I set out a simple plate of fruit and crackers, I saw their eyes dart toward it with a mix of longing and caution. The youngest reached first, then hesitated, and the older 2 quickly tucked pieces away into their pockets when they thought I wasn't looking. Hoarding. That old instinct children develop when meals are unpredictable. I had seen it before in my years as a nurse, but never imagined I would see it in my own family. The oldest, Ava, moved around the younger 2 with a practiced rhythm, guiding them with soft gestures, checking their faces, adjusting their sleeves, steadying them with a hand on the shoulder. She was only 12, but her posture carried the weight of someone who had learned to anticipate danger. The realization settled into me like cold water, spreading slow and heavy. I felt my initial concern tightening into something sharper, a protective edge I hadn't expected to feel so soon after surgery. Every small sign pointed to a life lived in survival mode, not childhood. And though they tried to appear calm, their bodies told the truth their voices hadn't shared yet. By evening, I could sense there were deeper wounds beneath their quietness, pieces of a story they were still too guarded to reveal. I knew the next days would uncover far more than I was ready for, but I also knew I had to face whatever came. Their truth was waiting just beneath the surface, and it was already beginning to rise. I woke the next morning to the soft shuffle of small feet moving through the hallway, far earlier than any child should be awake on a day without school. When I reached the kitchen, leaning heavily on my walker, I found all three of them already deep into a routine that clearly did not belong to this house. 12-year-old Ava stood on her toes, reaching into cabinets she knew too well for someone who had only arrived the day before. She moved with quiet efficiency, laying out bowls, portioning cereal, guiding her younger brother and sister as if she had been doing it every day of her life. 9-year-old Caleb hovered beside her, shoulders tense, watching every motion around him. His eyes darted toward the doorway each time I shifted my weight, as if bracing for something sharp or sudden. And the youngest, little Nora, clung to the table leg, her thumb tucked against her cheek, a regression I had seen in children overwhelmed by worry. None of this belonged to a normal childhood. It was survival dressed up as habit. As I stood there, taking in the scene, memories rose uninvited. I saw my son Ethan as a young father, back when he promised he would give his future children the stability he never had. I remembered the way he once believed in gentle structure and warm guidance. Seeing his children performing those roles for each other felt like watching those promises crumble into dust. Throughout the morning, the truth surfaced in small, devastating ways. Ava explaining household tasks she should never have been responsible for. Caleb tightening every time someone moved too quickly. Nora hiding food in her pockets as if the next meal was uncertain. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns etched into their bodies, evidence of years spent fending for themselves. By noon, the weight of it settled fully on my chest. This wasn't temporary neglect. This was a life they had been forced to navigate alone. And as that realization solidified, something inside me shifted. I knew I could not simply care for them for the week. I would have to do far more. The decision was already forming, steady and unavoidable, waiting for its moment to rise. It happened in a single, quiet moment. Caleb reached for a toy on the floor, and the sleeve of his shirt shifted just enough for me to see the faint outline of a bruise along his upper arm. It wasn't large, but it was old enough to have darkened into that deep, unmistakable shade I had seen far too many times in my years as a nurse. What struck me even harder was the way he froze when he realized I had seen it, his whole body bracing as if he expected to be scolded for simply existing. That reaction told me more than the bruise ever could. Something inside me tightened, sharp and cold, then settled into a clarity I had been resisting since they first stepped through my door. I felt heartbreak, anger, and fear all at once, a mix that pushed aside whatever doubt I'd been holding on to. I looked at these children and thought about the son I once knew, the one who had promised he would build a gentle home for his family. Somewhere along the way, those promises had slipped through his fingers, leaving his children carrying burdens they never should have known. The decision came to me not as a thought, but as a certainty. I would intervene. I would do it carefully, deliberately, without warning the adults who had allowed this to happen. My first step was reaching out to a retired social worker I trusted, someone I knew would recognize the signs with the same immediacy I had. Then I called my neighbor, a woman with a sharp eye and plenty of time, asking her to keep watch for anything out of the ordinary. And finally, I called Ethan, my son, disguising my concern beneath a calm tone, trying to understand whether he had any idea what was happening in his own home. By the end of the day, the path ahead had shifted. I was no longer a recovering grandmother hoping things were not as bad as they appeared. I had become something else entirely, a steady force preparing for what I sensed would be a life-changing confrontation. And as night settled around the house, I knew the next step would be gathering the truth, piece by piece, before the storm arrived. The retired social worker arrived the next afternoon, moving through my doorway with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen far too much in her lifetime. I stayed just out of sight as she spent time with the children, listening to the soft murmur of her questions and the even softer responses from the 3 small voices. I didn't need to hear every word to understand what she was discovering. The pauses told their own story, the shifting tones, the way her sighs grew heavier as the minutes passed. When she finally stepped into the kitchen, the look in her eyes confirmed everything I already feared. This wasn't recent. This was rooted, patterned, lived in. Yet even as she documented her observations, I saw something remarkable happening in the house. In only a few days, the children had begun to unfurl like tightly wound springs, finally given space to breathe. Ava woke a little later each morning, no longer rising before dawn to brace herself for the day. Caleb started finishing his meals instead of hiding pieces away for later, and little Nora, who had clung to silence when she arrived, began humming soft tunes as she walked from room to room. Small changes, yes, but unmistakable signs of safety taking hold. I realized then how quickly love, stability, and predictable care could begin to soften fear that had been accumulating for years. That truth settled into me with equal parts warmth and grief. The simple things I was offering them should not have felt extraordinary, yet they did. While the children played in the yard, unaware of the shifting ground beneath their feet, I felt the tension tightening inside me. Their parents moved through their week as if nothing had changed, oblivious to the fact that a reckoning was building with every note written, every observation recorded, every meal that revealed how hungry these children had been for more than food. By the time the sun dipped behind the foothills, I knew the confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching fast, inevitable and necessary, waiting for the moment to break open everything that had been hidden for far too long. They arrived on a gray Sunday afternoon, the kind of muted Colorado day when the sky feels heavy enough to press against your shoulders. I felt that same weight settle into my chest as their car pulled into the driveway. I had prepared myself for this moment, rehearsed my breathing, steadied the tremor in my hands. But nothing truly prepares you for watching 2 adults step out of a vehicle with the ease of people returning from a carefree week, unaware of what their absence had revealed. Inside the house, the children grew still. Their bodies remembered patterns long before their minds could process change. Ava instinctively positioned herself between her siblings. Caleb's shoulders lifted, bracing. Little Nora tucked herself close to my leg. The contrast was painful. They were guarded, alert. Their parents, on the other hand, entered the living room with an air of entitlement, scanning the space as if expecting gratitude instead of accountability. I met their presence with calm I did not entirely feel. Piece by piece, I laid out what the week had shown me: the clothing that hadn't been washed, the hoarding of food, the exhaustion etched into the children's routines. I watched their expressions shift from irritation to denial, the predictable cycle of people who think responsibility is optional. Then the front door opened again, and the retired social worker stepped inside. Her arrival changed the air instantly. She carried her notes, her observations, her professional certainty. The parents stiffened, finally sensing the edge of something they could no longer control. And then came the moment I had not anticipated, the one that altered everything. The children, unprompted, stepped forward. Ava spoke first with the steadiness of someone far older than 12. Caleb's quiet tremble filled in the unspoken pieces. Even Nora, in her small, hesitant way, revealed truths that no child should ever have to articulate through behavior alone. Their vulnerability became undeniable evidence. Their parents' reactions, anger, defensiveness, disbelief, only sharpened the clarity of the moment. I placed the documentation on the table, the week's notes, the photos, the social worker's assessments. I told them calmly that legal steps were already underway, that this was no longer a matter of personal disagreement, but a matter of protection. Their shock was immediate, visceral, but it came too late. As they sputtered through excuses, I felt something inside me shift from tension to certainty. The storm had broken open, and the aftermath was already waiting. What came next would be the beginning of a different kind of fight, one centered not on confrontation, but on custody, healing, and the slow rebuilding of 3 young lives. The days following the confrontation moved quickly, carried forward by court dates, paperwork, and the quiet urgency of doing what was right. When the judge granted me temporary custody, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow settle deep in my chest. It wasn't the future I had imagined at 67, but it was the safest place for the children to land. Their mother was limited to supervised visits, and Ethan was ordered into parenting classes and counseling, steps he accepted with a heaviness that hinted at regret, but also desire for change. Inside my home, a different transformation began. Ava slowly released the tight grip she had kept on responsibility. She joined school activities, allowing herself moments of silliness that had been absent from her life for far too long. Caleb's anxiety softened into curiosity, and I started seeing him approach each day with a little more confidence. And sweet Nora began sleeping through the night, her small body finally believing it no longer had to stay alert. Even Ethan changed. He showed up with a steadiness I hadn't seen in years, helping with homework, sharing meals, learning how to be present rather than exhausted or distracted. I watched him rebuild himself piece by piece, not for appearances, but for the children who were learning to trust him again. My house, once quiet and still after my surgery, became a sanctuary filled with noise, routine, and small, steady joys. The contrast between where we had started and where we stood now was unmistakable. Healing had taken root, and each day grew stronger. As I looked around at this fragile but blooming new life, I felt the story settling toward its closing chapter, ready for the reflection that waited just ahead. This experience reminded me that protection often begins in the smallest moments, the ones where instinct whispers louder than fear. Standing up for my grandchildren taught me how courage grows quietly, one choice at a time, and how healing unfolds when safety finally takes root. Their journey became my own reminder that we are never too old to fight for what is right. Thank you for listening to this story and sharing this space with me. If you have ever had to stand up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves, I hope you'll share your experience in the comments. I would truly love to hear it.